First of all, we're here to do a job, and we're going to do it well.
Tonight, the number of troops deployed to the Mexican border has peaked at 5,800. President Trump sent them there to secure the border against what he called a, quote, invasion of migrants.
One of the people leading the border support mission can be found right here in San Antonio.
Eyewitness News military reporter Luke Simons was given an exclusive interview with the field commander of the border response to get a better idea of the military's role in stopping migrants from crossing the border.
Seeing a group of military members setting up camp and going to work inside the United States along the southern border can be a lot for someone to take in.
Obviously, we bring a lot of unique equipment. We bring a lot of unique capabilities, manpower.
Lieutenant General Jeffrey Buchanan is the man in charge of the operation on the ground. He says despite having 5,800 or so troops deployed at the border, looks can be a little deceiving.
We're not there to militarize anything.
General Buchanan explains the military response is a support of law enforcement mission. Military members are there to help U.S. Customs and Border Protection in areas of need.
And in this particular case, they asked us to help control access to the ports of entry and deter access between ports of entry. They asked us for aviation support.
Those helicopters are currently being used in California, moving CBP agents quickly. In Texas, military engineers are putting up fencing and other barriers like concertina wire. But the biggest question, what are the rules of force?
In general terms, we always have what we call the inherent right of self-defense. We're authorized to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves, which is really what our military police are doing all along the border. Is they're there in a security role to help protect us because we didn't want to pull away from local law enforcement to ask them to protect us.
Buchanan pointed out in the interview the Army did not send infantry battalions to the border. Instead, there are military police focused on protecting the military that is in the field.
They're badged, they're trained on using the minimum amount of force necessary to control a situation. They use what we call a graduated response. If they can control someone with verbal commands, that's where they stop.
As of now, Buchanan has not decided to shift any of the troops to California, even though the first migrants of the caravan have arrived. But that can change.
But when people say this is like an election tactic and things like that, how do you respond to those types of things?
Secretary Mattis, I'm not sure I can quote him exactly, but he was asked a question about, is this a stunt? And he said, we don't do stunts. And we don't. We have viable, actual missions, and that's in fact what we're doing.
And that was Luke Simons reporting. Now, General Buchanan said the plan for the military is to continue to assist CBP until December 15th. But he said if they are not needed that long, they could leave at an earlier date.